start recording. Welcome to Bible study. And Logan, I think you have an update about your family. We better hear from you.
Which part? There's so much going on.
Well, your grandfather and then your grandmother. So we
I update on Grandma yet. She's still in the emergency room. We don't know what's going on there yet.
So your grandpa died 3 days ago, and now your grandmother's not doing very well. That's pretty sad.
And we don't know if it's or if it's something more. It feels like it's something more, but it could be grief. We don't know. I mean, who knows at this point?
Yeah, and stress can do a lot of crazy things.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Larry and Donna have out-of-town guests, so they won't be joining us. So this might be our crew here. I don't know about you, but all of a sudden this scripture became awfully personal to what's going on in the Washington, D.C. era here. You have heard that it was said, and so we had a bunch of those. This is the last two of those. You have heard that it was said. And what would make us look peculiar if we were at the Capitol? Anybody have any ideas of how we might look peculiar?
That's an interesting question. How would we handle a mob like that as a Christian? Would you try to de-escalate? Would you try to run off and get a cup of coffee someplace where it's safe? Or, man, I think that's a tough question.
Right. And we had people giving their lives to save other people.
Yeah. Would a guy have the courage to stand in front of a door with a mob closing in on him and knowing that and you could even get easily mixed up with the folks that were breaking in too, to where you could be accused of being a part of them instead of trying to de-escalate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
Well, it's like, my first thought was, no, you wouldn't find me in Washington, period, right now.
I agree with that.
Just not there, but I was thinking politician, I was not thinking, the crowd either holding them in, holding them off, or busting in. I didn't go there. I went more to what about, well, I wouldn't be a representative in Washington so much for Martin Brumbaugh, I mean, there's something about the lifestyle and belief system that we claim that, in my thinking, which is pretty limited, which in my thinking does not tell us to go into these venues.
To be in politics, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
and it used to be, well, good brethren weren't lawyers, or, I mean, I think so go figure.
Vicki referred to Martin Brumbaugh, who was a governor of Pennsylvania during World War I time. So that's about the one example that we have of someone getting that high up in elected office in the Church of the Brethren. We have lawyers in the Church of the Brethren, and who have done.
I didn't realize that brethren were not supposed to be involved politically, I guess. That's interesting.
There's no rule that says you can't be involved politically. There's no bylaws that say that, but it's like I said, the way I see it is that once you sort of claim peculiar, the values that so much of the brethren embody, it just doesn't lead you down those paths. And there certainly can be folks who would discourage you. We don't have any law schools.
I think it's important to also remember that the Church of the Brethren does have the Office of Public Witness, which is Church of the Brethren in Washington lobbying basically on Brethren values. So Brethren do actually take a pretty active, mainly young at the point that are there, but because I actually listened to a podcast from those folks, but yeah, well, there are Brethren that are a part of the Office of Public Witness that are very active lobbying in government.
So Fred, there's something called National Citizenship Seminar that the Church of the Brethren puts on, and it's amazing. It's offered to juniors and seniors in high school, and it was like a really, really big thing. I went, and you go to Washington, and you meet your representatives, and you visit the various Capitol buildings, and you go to New York and visit the UN, and there's a theme, and you get presenters, and they come in and they address the theme, whether it's hunger or the environment or whatever becomes, the theme of the moment. It's a wonderful educational, learn about your government, walk the halls of Congress, and yeah, it's just an amazing experience, and it's all Church of the Brethren stuff. So yeah. I mean, I went to Washington in the 70s, late 60s. I did my march on Washington to protest the Vietnam War. So, heard the speakers, walked on the streets, and it's, yeah. So
That was going to be my next question, was whether Brethren, I've never participated. I've never participated in a protest march. But then, I've also been disconnected from the Brethren for quite a while. And so I'm kind of coming back and trying to refine some of my roots, I guess is one way to put it.
Well, I welcome Kathy, and
Thank you.
we're talking about what peculiar people would look like if we were at the Capitol or in Washington D.C. during
Well, I hope we'd be behaving decently.
Right. Maybe a little better behaved than some. I just opened my mail today, and I got my Christian Citizenship Seminar flyer or postcard that's explaining who's eligible, and the theme is economic justice this year. And so high school kids are encouraged to go, like Vicki said. And it doesn't mean that and Logan was saying we have an office of public witness in Washington D.C.
Hello.
Oops, we lost somebody. Oh, and I don't think the Mennonites have an office of public witness. The Methodists do, some other denominations, but one of the differences between the Mennonites and us is that we're more likely to
Hello.
be in the midst of getting our hands dirty, in terms of politics and asking about, having influence.
Well, I think that, with what's going on in Washington, D.C., of course, it wasn't spontaneous, but, folks. So what, maybe the question would be, if you knew that was happening in a month, would there be something that would be good to do? So there's an organization called Christian Peacemaker Teams that many Brethren, I mean, it's not huge, but Brethren have been part of it. In particular, there's a a gentleman named Cliff Kindy, and he has just written a new book about his experiences with this organization. And what they basically do is to be active peacemakers and go into situations where there is conflict. So, for example, they've had a presence in Israel, Palestine, in the territories, and they will do things like walk with school children to school, or put themselves in between persons who are being persecuted and perhaps Israeli soldiers with guns. So, and it's not spontaneous, it's very thought out. It's trying to be a witness, and they're trained to understand that they could be injured themselves. So that not everybody thinks that's a great idea to be doing that, but there are certainly, I would say, Brethren and Mennonites and others who would subscribe to that sort of active peacemaking. So, eye for an eye. No, we're going to try to keep you from doing the eye for an eye thing.
So this would be more like the freedom buses back in the civil rights days.
Yeah,
Not
I think
back in the civil rights days, but
yeah, there'd be some parallels with that kind of philosophy, and very Kingian in terms of nonviolence. Definitely.
And there was a gentleman, I forget his name, who was killed by the bulldozers when they were standing in front of the bulldozers who were going to plow down the homes of the Palestinians.
Yes, it was a young woman actually, and I don't have her name right on the top of my.
Her name is Rachel somebody.
Yeah, and there's a play that's been written about that, and I think you could probably track that down pretty easily. But yeah, there have been persons who have lost their lives witnessing for peace. So what would you do in Washington, D.C.? Well, if you knew it was happening, you might have a nonviolent, peaceful presence and try, but in such a crowd kind of situation, like, it would be difficult, no doubt.
But the brethren are found in difficult situations. So, you guys were talking about Israel, Palestine. I was going to mention that Church of the Brethren actually has a presence in North Korea, which is very abnormal for any church to have. So, they're working on reaching across that way and providing those folks, teaching them how to grow food and things like that. So I think that if we were in Washington, we'd be trying that kind of route, the peaceful way.
Right. Vicky's turn.
Yeah. So this is more after the fact. I mean, I would see brethren, and I think this is a very real possibility in that now what could be done rather than eye for eye and tooth for tooth is you bring in restorative justice practices and you work at healing and reconciling and holding accountable and making restitution and repairing harm. And I mean, that was just popping up in my brain, all this week, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, on Sunday in the Denver Post, there was an article about the conflict center where I work. It was mostly about the Beth McCann and the
Attorney General
thing. Yeah, so it's Denver's version of that, and the prosecutor's office. And they have been working with the Denver DA's office to do restorative justice for a variety of cases. And I think they've done like 60 some or something like that through the year. And it's, it keeps people don't have to go to jail, but they do have to agree to make things right, repair the harm, do some kind of restitution, and then it does, rebuild relationship. Rather, it's the restorative model as opposed to the punitive model. And and what do we need if you think about our current US? In some ways we're in a civil war, and it's like, how do we get out of that? And how do we indeed repair all the harms that have been done? Because everybody's going to have their story about, yeah, but you did this to me. And so,
One of the things I've been reading about brethren in the civil rights movement is Ralph Smeltzer was hugely important as an almost invisible back channel person going between in Birmingham, Alabama, where those three young girls were killed in a church bombing on a Sunday morning. He was helping to help the white Christians figure out how to come down out of that violence. And so the other thing I learned is that in the civil rights movement, there's before the march, during the march, and after the march, and they had ideas and a plan for what should be a part of each part of that. So if we are before Capitol, during the Capitol, and after the Capitol, we might have three different things that we might have to do that would be peculiar that we could actually contribute to.
What-
Go ahead. It's a little late now, but
That's fine. What do you see as, like, I'm trying to think through the difference between retaliation, revenge, punishment, whatever you want to call it, versus setting up a situation that may appear punitive, but you're trying to keep this from rehappening.
so that sounds like accountability, maybe.
Well, yeah, to some extent, and not just. I mean, I think it's important for Christians to forgive and to move on. On the other hand, I worry about if this person is going to repeat the activity, there needs to be some way to keep that from happening again. Doesn't there?
Right.
Yeah, and I think what you're partly describing is restitution for harm done, so that someone is held accountable, another way to put it, and then what are protections that can be put into place. And that may mean putting somebody into jail or something like that, if they are intent on harming somebody, because you want to protect them.
So that came in this reading too. So that was a debate by Peter Need. Someone want to read that paragraph out loud? Is that?
Sure, I can read it. From Peter Need, an early brethren leader rejected the idea that Christians are opposed to the civil powers. Need said, not so. For I say it is right and agreeable to the will of God that as long as there are lawless and disobedient persons on the earth, that there should exist a civil authority. And when I say that the children of God are not under the law,
Sorry.
I got lost.
Sorry.
And when I say that the children of God are not under the law, I mean that they are not to make use of the law so as to compel any of their fellow mortals into measures, whatever, I'm not sure what the term measures means, or to bring any of them into punishment. No, the children of God must not take vengeance on any man. To establish this assertion, we have the precepts and examples of Jesus Christ and his apostles.
So so he was saying that could you ever use the civil authorities to do God's work? And I think, what was his answer then? Can we figure out what he was trying to say?
Well, I think part of, I think what he's saying, so let's say you're against the death penalty as a Christian. So I do not want to compel fellow mortals into using the death penalty. That would be my example. In other words, I'm absolving myself. I'm keeping myself pure, but it's okay. So he's saying, no, children of God shouldn't take vengeance on any man. So I guess I see that, the argument I see there is boundaries. And to tie it back into our passage, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, using imagination to think through, that's what I think restorative justice is. It's an imaginative way, not imaginative, but it's using your imagination to think about alternative ways of dealing with very difficult situations. And, that particular model, and it's just one model, there's other ways maybe to approach it, is where you bring together offender and the person who has been offended. And it has to be safe for both. And if it's not safe for both, I think this is right, Vicki, you would never bring an offender into a situation where the person who was offended would be damaged. That would never happen with restorative justice. Is that true?
That is true.
Yeah.
And recidivism in those kinds of instances is very low, meaning folks don't do it again, because restorative justice truly focuses. So our system of laws reflects punishment, and you're the bad person and you did the bad things, and we're going to do whatever we're going to do to you, whatever the law says that it's okay to do. But restorative practices focuses on the person who's been harmed. They're the person who gets the most attention. And now you have a whole entirely different process of bringing this person who has caused harm to sit and be in conversation and in relationship and hear the impact, and then really work around and through. And there are variations on this theme. The Native American model brings in a whole huge circle of community. And so now you recognize your place in the community, and you have lots of folks giving input, which is both supportive. Well, it's all supportive in whether it's, here's how we can help you do this better, or, walk with you to learn something or whatever. But then you also recognize your place in relationship to everybody else. So there's just different models for doing it. But after going through it, it's a whole different system, rather than somebody doing these things to you, punishment, vengeance, whatever Peter Need is saying there, whatever these measures are to punish you, it's you're participating in it and you're owning up to yours. And oftentimes there is a backstory. There's more story to the person who caused harm as well as the person who experienced harm. And that just brings it into such a whole different dynamic.
Which creates less recidivism. I've taken responsibility, and now I understand why this was not the correct choice to make, and here's what I could do. So yeah, totally invest people instead of being put out, put upon, they're now a participant in. Yeah, it's pretty miraculous. So going back to here, we have verse 38 says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This Brethren book says that verse is talking about individuals within community. How do they deal with persons from outside the faith? So you're walking along with all your brethren, and then someone comes up and slaps you on the cheek. So it's, what do you do with these outsiders that don't know how to behave right? So then that was the Walter Wink saying, yeah, just turn the other cheek, because then that's going to make them look inferior. They're going to look like they have violated their rightful place if they're smacking you with a backhand, which is which which is a, puts you in a bad social standing if you're seen doing that kind of violence. And then if you do if they take off your coat, then you're going to be forced to be naked, which brings embarrassment on the person who's tried to do you wrong. So it doesn't look like you're supposed to be a wallflower, but you're supposed to say, this is not right, this is not okay, how this person is treating others. And then these last verses for what to do with persons and groups that are antagonistic to itself. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So what do we do with fellow Americans, I think, is what this one is saying. Did we see that happening at the Capitol? Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you.
I didn't want to get into political stuff, but I was kind of wondering the same thing as they did the impeachment thing today. I was trying to figure out in my own mind whether that's a revenge or a prevention of something happening in the future.
I think it's part of both.
Yeah, does it have to be one or the other? Yeah, good question.
Well, I think definitely emotions are high right now. There's no doubt about that. And, when you look at this passage, it's like, if you get your eye knocked out, what's the first thing you want to do is you want to kind of retaliate. And it's almost like saying, you gotta, this is where that imagination part comes in. And I think you have to do it ahead of time. In other words, you don't just come across these situations and then react the way you want to, or you're going to react rather than act, I guess. And I think just from our discussion here about these few examples shows that it's pretty serious stuff to think about this. And it really, I've seen some folks refer to it this way. It's part of what discipleship is. Becoming a disciple means, really thinking through this. And I don't think you can do that by yourself. I mean, you can try, but I think it has to be done in community. And, like all the questions we're raising now, these are the questions that should be raised because they're the real life thing. Well, what am I going to do in this situation? Or what am I going to do in that situation? How do I handle this? And maybe last thing, bringing it back to, Vicki, you asked earlier or mentioned about Martin Brumbaugh, right? I mean, why would a Church of the Brethren guy become governor during World War I of a state of the United States? I mean, he was in charge of the National Guard and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm not sure that was the best thing, but obviously the Brethren tradition has evolved over time, and and the Brethren never agreed about this stuff, and we still don't, right? We still have our arguments about it, but some probably thought, Martin Brumbaugh as governor could be a steadying influence and prevent it from being even worse than it could have been. You know what I mean? Or others would have said, no, he should never have done it because he sullied himself. I'm kind of happy to be part of a group that wants to wrestle with those rather than you can only be one way. That's my stance.
Yeah, I think the real questions are not that easily answered.
Well said. And welcome, Howard and Jan. Glad to see your faces. We're debating the Capitol and what we would do if we were brethren, if we were at the Capitol with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and turn the other cheek. And So the other thing I wanted to talk about was Vicky's going to be talking about a brethren, um, one of our brethren beliefs that there's no force in religion. And so, what does that mean when you use the Capitol Police to save your life? So, that's always a hard one for me. Do I? Um, so um, I've heard different people say, oh, who was it recently? Oh, it was Jim, the former FBI Comey. What's his name? Is Dave? We saw him on. Is his name Jim Comey?
Jim Comey, yep.
Yeah, he was on Stephen Colbert last
Stephen
night, and
Colbert.
he said he does not believe in capital punishment, but he's a law enforcement guy, you know. So, is there a place for law enforcement in our brethren beliefs because people are not going to behave nicely?
Well, people are not going to behave nicely. That's just kind of the way life works. Or I'm fine with what I'm doing, but you're not fine with what I'm doing. Ask my siblings how much of a bully they think I am. As the oldest, we were having that very discussion today on our Skype call. You know, so it's in the capacity to, can you be brethren and be a police officer? I think I read in Messenger one time, there was an article about a guy who was a police officer, and you know, how that forms how he enforces the law and how he relates to people. And what does that mean? How does his faith, you know, come out? And he had a lot of good things to say, as I recall. I don't think you don't have police, you know, you have schools, you have principals, you have teachers, you have folks who are saying that's not okay, come sit in this corner for a while, you know, or whatever. You know, and maybe the corner has bars on it and somebody just does not know how to play nicely with people, and so you need a really big timeout. um, uh, so but there's so many different ways to do that. You know, do you escalate things? Do you provoke? Do you attack? Or do you de-escalate? And do you teach and
Is it a
act?
learning opportunity? Yeah, or is it a punishment opportunity? Yeah.
I
Well,
had
yeah, it's a big generalization, but I was thinking about Britain, you know, Bobbies, the police there, who, you know, for most of history, they didn't carry firearms. Now, I'm sure some of them do now,
No, they
but, you
don't.
know,
They do not
they
still.
still don't. Okay. So, you know, that's a very different kind of policing theory or training, all that sort of stuff. And, you know, and clearly in our country, we've gone more to a militarization of policing in many ways. And so then, I mean, it's very complex, and I don't want to pretend like it's not, but sometimes that lends itself to more violence. I mean, that certainly has been argued.
I went to church in my youth and in high school with a Church of the Brethren friend who was a pacifist and refused to join the war effort in Vietnam, but later became a police officer and did catch a lot of flack over avoiding the military but becoming a police officer. And you know, it's a, I mean, it seems like there's so many ways to view it. It's like that's the kind of guy I would like to have as a police officer. As you talk about the other brethren who was a governor, that's the kind of guy you'd like to have in that position, that violence and retribution are not the first actions that they take. Um, and yet, how do you deal with that in terms of compromising your own principles?
Interesting. Yeah.
And I did see a story, in terms of the last few days, about a chaplain. Now this is not obviously with the attackers or the rioters, and there's all those words, however you're going to use it. But the chaplain that was inside and just prayed with people, while this was going on, and how that changed. So I'm looking down at verse. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and I'll do a little bit of, pray with those who persecute you, right? I mean, just, engaging in an act like that would just totally change the atmosphere, not change necessarily your viewpoints right away, but again, it's being an imaginative kind of thing. And this reminds me of a book called What Would You Do? So real quick, a story, a robber breaks into your house and has a gun on you, and and the person says to them, well, let's pray together, or let me get you something to eat or drink, or in other words, change the dynamic, that there are different ways of dealing with things than diving for your gun under the table, to deal with this situation. No guarantees that it's going to work, but it's an attempt to diffuse it.
I know of several stories like that where people are about to be attacked or killed or raped or whatever, and they take an entirely different approach than a fear-based, I'm going to fight you off kind of tack. And so there's very little in our society that teaches us this imaginative way to deal with folks who are appearing to cause, who are going to cause us harm. At least that's what's in our mind. And so how do you, when you feel threatened, what do you do? The, natural response is to react, like you were saying, as opposed to move to a different kind of space. But that takes thinking and planning and prepping and a heart and a readiness to go there, to go to that spot, and the thinking in your own brain that you're not going to take a violent approach, you're going to take a different, really extraordinary kind of way.
I heard someone interviewed on Thursday last week who was at the door when they were bashing it in. He'd been elected and sworn in for 3 days. When he was at the door, a new representative from Texas talking to the persons on the other side. So he was a pro-Trumper saying, hey, I totally understand. I'm angry too, but this is not how we settle these things. And he was doing all these innovative, imaginative ways of trying to de-escalate. And I don't know what his background was, but it was amazing to see him and put into action. And then my other friend, Barbara Date, and mentor in nonviolence, said that every time that she was part of a peaceful protest, there was nonviolent training for weeks ahead of time. So you never went to the Capitol until you had been through intensive training on what to do if they spit on you, what to do if they beat you on the head, what to do, where's your community of people that you depend on each other so you're not backed into a corner and have to act like a wild animal to get out. And I don't think we did not see that kind of preparation going into this situation. It wasn't a peaceful protest.
Well, and the other thing that I wonder about in terms of protest situations, I really have mixed feelings about them. On the one hand, I think there are things that on occasion I would like to do to support a particular position. But then on the other side, I think if things go south, I don't want to be associated with that. And so I don't know, I struggle with that a lot.
So what keeps coming to my mind is, and I've said this before, it's a quote from Martin Luther King, and just like examples here, the scriptural examples. It's how to be powerful, peacefully and lovingly. And that's what we don't know an awful lot about. Martin Luther King said, power used well is love, implementing the demands of justice. So go figure.
So this this brethren text in transit. This love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. An eye for an eye. These are one of the key brethren scriptures that we keep going back to and emphasizing and teaching over and over again. And they're saying that the culmination of all these, you have been heard, but I said, is this. They all lead to the same point. Ultimate godlikeness lies in the grace to treat all persons with respect and love. And so if you're going to turn the other cheek or go another mile, you're trying to say, this is the way that Jesus has taught us, not to retaliate, not to punish, but to turn it up and say, we're all children of God. So when do we learn that in our preparation for transfer of power in Washington, D.C.? Is the other party children of God? We can't even agree that they're hardly Americans, let alone children, beloved of God.
Well, yet I remember as I was watching it, I saw at least one sign, Jesus saves, being walked through the crowd. And I wondered what that was about.
Wow.
If you're
Vivian and
interested, there's a website called, what's that?
go ahead.
There's a website called Religion News, and you could Google that, and they've had a few articles about those kinds of signs. What do they mean? And symbolism and going through that. I'm just thinking about this passage. There's these 10 verses. To me, they're like just the barest starting place to how to think through some of these issues. And maybe this relates to like a sign like Jesus saves. Gosh, it's so easy to just take a proof text sort of approach, right? Like love everybody, okay? Or Jesus saves, and like that's going to get us through these situations. I don't think so. That's where I think, and again, we're dealing with something that came up, and now we're after the fact trying to analyze it, and maybe to try to be better ready next time something like this happens. So I want to be careful not to like say, oh, I've got all the answers how to figure this out. All I know is, gosh, this, what happened is horrific. And we need to think through a lot of different things about how we deal with politics, how we deal with differences, and keeping people safe, right? I think it's pretty amazing. None of our legislators were not injured or killed in the last week. I think that was really close to happening, and I'm really grateful that didn't. I think that's grace that it did.
If there would have been several people killed, including like the vice president, the speaker of the House, McConnell, whatever, if there'd have been several people like that killed, I wonder what scenario we would be dealing with at this point. And then B, the other thing that I was once told, well, Fred, at your age, you've had enough experience that you know how you're going to react in any given situation. And I'm going, I don't know how I'm going to react. I like the idea of rehearsing, but I have surprised myself on too many occasions of reacting in ways that I really afterwards thought, was that really me? Did I really say that or do that or whatever? And I think it requires a lot of self-examination and a lot of learning.
I completely agree with that. It takes a lot of rehearsal and thought and intention and yeah, trying it and not getting it right and trying again. So I think that's essential to build it in. I've had this thought. It's pretty wild, and and it's fine to say that's pretty wild, Vicky. So we're talking about none of the legislators were killed. And I just wonder, so back when the Black Lives Matter protest was there, they brought in the National Guard in their full military outfit, their kit, their full kit. And this time, so that in and of itself is an escalation effort. Just that appearance is an escalator for people. They didn't have any of that, and the Capitol Police don't even have helmets on, half of them. They're just, walking around with their little hats and their sticks and the element of there not being this force. And we can have the whole racial conflict conversation. That's another aspect of the complications of all of this, like that David's pointing out. But just the fact that there wasn't that much resistance, those Capitol officers were doing the best they could with the little bit that they had, but it didn't carry that escalation kind of element to it. And maybe that helped in the result of other folks not being killed. So, I mean, go ahead, say whatever you think. He's weird again.
Well, and again, I guess looking at it that way, it would, if you were in charge of the inauguration on the 20th, would you minimize the protective elements, which is exactly the opposite of what we're doing now? I mean, we're and if I was being inaugurated, I hate to say this, but man, I'd want a bunch of tanks around me. I think, I'd be scared.
I think I'd go someplace quiet and I'd make it real small, but right, we're now at the place, this is what we do. We escalate, we get bigger. My gun is bigger than your gun, and that's just excuse me, the way we know how.
Well, and that's why we talk about these things as affinity groups, which would be people who would be making a commitment to walk with each other in the midst of danger and take care of one another and help in their specific roles. And so we haven't had that training. And so nobody in the Capitol Police is getting that training either. I mean, they're getting the training that they know how is to fight force with force, which in this situation, it seems like a little late to change the rules of the game when they've already, it seems a little odd to have so many protected people sleeping in the Capitol when it's a little late. They weren't there last week to sleep in the Capitol, but here they are.
Well,
So
I think we have to keep in mind this definitely, I mean, there's a long history of protest at the Capitol. There have been protests, groups, whatever. This one was of a different sort in terms of the planning. I mean, I don't think we know enough yet, but the planning and the violence, the rhetoric. I mean, that's what all of our legislators were arguing about today with impeachment. Who really that, does our president bear responsibility for that rhetoric? And I think that all plays into it as well. It's very complicated. There's no doubt.
So Vivian and Lyle, you've been quiet and.
Well,
anything
I
you-
was thinking that we should treat everybody with respect, even if they're not well behaved. Because that's where it says, love your enemies or pray for your enemies. Everybody deserves to be treated with respect. And if you do that, it might make a difference in that person's life because they may not have been treated with respect before. And so that was sort of what I was thinking while you were talking. And
There-
God did make everybody, so that's why we're supposed to love everybody, not whether they behave or not. And praying for your enemy, I think, is a pretty good idea. You may not be able to do it, but at least you look at a different attitude and let me see how mean I can be to that person.
Yeah, you have something that has evidence behind it. They have examples of where being treated with respect changes the people who are calling up and giving death threats against Martin Luther King Jr. and stuff like that. People had their life changed when they got treated with respect in the midst of all that bad behavior.
I of course teach a lot of police, but we have friends that have permits to carry, and they go wherever they go, they take a loaded gun with them. Statistically, the chance of being shot if you're carrying a gun is many, many times what it is if you're disarmed. One thing is you're likely to be shot with your own gun. The other thing is that the other person, the person wishing you ill, is going to get the drop on you because they get the first draw, and that can be fatal. And this is even true with police. Half of the police in the United States, at least it used to be, half of the police in the United States are shot with their own gun. And some drunk pulls their gun out and shoots them. And I used to argue with police that if they had a flap and a buckle on their holster, they'd be a lot safer. And I never could convince a single police officer that he didn't need quick draw capability. And, so we have this mentality of the Wild West, actually a mentality of what never really existed in the Wild West. And that is the gunslinger type of mentality. So anyway.
Right, we're easily getting into the Wild West kind of culture if we continue on this path, I'm afraid.
The irony is that's not what the Wild West was really like. Guys that had guns, like my grandfather, couldn't shoot them very well. And the main thing was, if you were caught in the stirrup, you might possibly pull your big barreled revolver and shoot the horse. And that was the main reason they had it. Or a cow or a horse with a broken leg, you could dispatch it. They didn't go along, and usually they carried the gun in the saddlebag. My grandfather said only once did a gun save his life. That was because he left it home. And he didn't have the gun, and the other guy did. They would have shot it out, except for the fact he didn't have a gun.
Wow, that's pretty funny. Kathy, you have anything to add?
Well, I just think there was no way to calm those people down last week in the middle of that. It was too far gone. So how do we fix it the next time?
Right, good, exactly, the good point.
And how do we prevent it? What can we do to prevent a similar situation from
Right.
occurring? Yeah.
Well, other than shooting the woman, the police did an absolutely marvelous job. They herded Congress out of harm's way and protected Congress. And the more they TV showed the guys trashing the place, the more the police came off well. I think the police did a wonderful job. Everybody else will criticize them, but they didn't pull their guns and just start shooting people. And there was a big danger that that would happen.
Yeah.
So Howard and Jan, we haven't heard much from you. Anything?
I'm kind of with Vicky. I'd go for I would go for a quiet place. I was just thinking, about if I was going to be inaugurated for something, I think I'd have mine done in a cave someplace.
Yeah.
I think, I think we have to be careful about the moves that we make that we do that to keep from escalating, the thing, and no matter what it is. And so it's tricky. And of course you have to be, in the process, you have to be sincere and not arrogant in whatever action you're taking. Because if you
Right.
are, whoever you're dealing with will just see right through it.
So this text has been an important one all through the years, and civil war, civil rights, all the way up to last week. So we're still working on it, trying to figure it out, how to make it. I mean, it seems to me we have a place where the nation can use some of our best theology. I mean, fighting, getting bigger and bigger guns doesn't seem to have been the proven answer either. So,
one other thing, if I could just toss it in, and we don't have time to discuss it here, but in my work over my 40 plus year career, the times that I struggled with the most, I think, were when drugs were involved or mental illness was involved. And that a lot of time takes the ability to reason out of it. If somebody like one of my workers came in my office and they had on their cell phone, a guy was on his way into the office with a gun and he said, "I'm going to shoot all of you guys." And it's like he was high on drugs, and it's like, this is not going to be a whole lot of fun,
yeah.
because they're not in their right mind at that point, and the logic isn't there, and that's a whole nother arena as well, I think. And I'll shut up.
Well, that's why I think this Peter Need quote is, we're not saying that we don't need a civil authority, because there are lawless and disobedient persons on the earth. So he was not saying, just get rid of all the authorities, but it's don't use them for revenge, don't use them for retaliation. Could we use them to prevent harm? That seems like a brethren thing maybe that we could agree on. So prayers for Larry and Donna's new grandson-in-law. His brother has COVID and there was no room for him. I think that in Arkansas that he was just in a hallway in the hospital in his 20s, very sick and trying to get treatment. So we've got lots of people. And your mom, how's your mom doing, Kathy?
We had another incident last week, but she's in a safe place now.
Oh boy. I'm going to stop the sharing and see if I can stop the recording.